Thank you very much. I'd like to go to Congresswoman Robin Kelly for her 5 minutes of questioning. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is critical that we recognize that these voter suppression measures are not simply attempts to act on former President Trump's big lie. For years, Texas Republicans have tried desperately to blunt the impact of demographic trends that threaten their stranglehold on power. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Texas is a very diverse state. Nearly 40% of its population is Hispanic or Latino, and almost 13% is Black or African American, as you see in the slide. Starting in 2018, we saw racially diverse populations in major cities drift away from the Republican Party. In 2020, non-white voters cast their ballots at a rate of 9% higher than they had in 2016, enabling President Biden to perform better in the state than any other Democrat in decades. This performance was fueled by those large cities like Houston, which saw its highest turnout in nearly 30 years, due in large part to efforts to expanded ballot access. Ms. Perales, you fight for voting rights for Latino communities. How do you think these demographic shifts in Texas electorate have influenced these restrictive voting measures?
In our view, there's a direct connection between the diversification of the Texas electorate and these moves to restrict or tighten Texas election law. And the one example I will give you is that from 2014 to 2018, Latino voter turnout increased to such a degree that Latinos cast almost 1 million more votes statewide in Texas in 2018 when compared to 2014. Those types of shifts in the electorate are very challenging for those in power who think that Latinos will not support them.
And have you seen the same efforts in other parts of the country that would necessitate the need for federal legislation?
Yes, there is a nationwide trend to tighten election laws in response to increasing racial diversity in the electorate in more than just Texas.
Thank you. Rep. Brunel, what do you make of the argument that these restrictions have less to do with voter fraud and more to do with shifting political tides?
I think the policy itself bears that out. I think it's hard to argue that you're trying to combat voter fraud when it's more likely that you get struck by lightning or a meteor, we did the math, than there being voter fraud in Texas. It just doesn't exist. I think that the zeitgeist, the national fear that's been created by the big lie fuels that, but you would have a hard time drawing a direct line from any part of this bill, any policy, to a case or instance of voter fraud in the last 17 years, if not the last several decades.
Thank you. Rep. Thompson, Rep. Collier, you also represent rapidly growing cities. According to the census, the Houston, which is going to overtake Chicago if we're not careful, and Dallas metro areas had the largest population gains of any metro region between 2010 and 2020. Rep. Collier, how have you seen voter suppression efforts in Austin intensify in response to this population growth?
Thank you for the question. In fact, the suppression, too often we look for overt and obvious signs of suppression, but suppression can be emulated in long lines. It could be creating harsher penalties for making simple mistakes. So it may not look like the poll tax and the literacy test of old time, but suppression can rear its ugly head in various subtle forms. And so going back to the question about if we have ballots that have multiple languages on them, the only reason we have that is because of the protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 1975, the state of Texas was required to provide multiple languages in the ballot only because we had the protections under that Voting Rights Act, which only elevates and shows the need for having this type of provision again. So Texas was made to do these multiple languages. It wasn't done on its own. And so unless we have federal intervention, we will continue to see the chipping away of our rights.
You know, my colleague took the time to go through step by step what you need a voter identification for. And there were a lot of things, but it's not just about voter identification, it's voter identification mixed in with everything else that you have to do. And I don't know if one of the reps or Ms. Perales, if you want to respond to that.
And your time is up, but let's let Ms. Perales respond. That's great.
I'd just like to make 2 quick points. One, voting is a fundamental right. Voting is not the same as going to the store and buying a bottle of liquor, and it should never be equated that way. That's demeaning to the right to vote. Second of all, Texas had a voter ID law, and unfortunately, surgically made it tighter and more restrictive in a way that a federal court found was discriminatory against minority voters. So an ID can be certainly much more expansive than what was provided in Texas when it was found to be discriminatory. And you should know that because of that federal court ruling now, Texas had to broaden the opportunity for voters to vote.
Thank you so much.
And I thank the representative. Before I recognize Mr. Franklin for his